My parents stalked me, tried to ruin my credit and showed up at my job, but I made they'd never find me again, and then. Growing up, I never felt like my life belonged to me. I was 26, living under my parents' roof not by choice, but because every time I tried to save money and leave, they found a way to keep me stuck. My job paid well enough for me to afford my own place, but I never got to keep most of my paycheck. My dad, Richard, insisted I contribute nearly everything to family expenses, rent, utilities, groceries. Yet I never saw a single bill. Somehow, despite my money constantly vanishing into the black hole of their finances, we were always barely making it. Meanwhile, he always had the latest gadget, and my mom, Diane, never came home from a shopping trip empty-handed. Whenever I questioned where all the money was going, I got the same response. You don't need to worry about that. Just do your part. Privacy didn't exist. My mom saw my room as an extension of her own space, treating it like her personal treasure hunt. If she found anything she didn't like, a book, a gift from a friend, even a receipt, she would confront me about it as if I had committed a crime. My phone wasn't mine either. They made me share my passcode in case of emergencies, but in reality, they used it to scroll through my texts, check my calls, and monitor my social media. Once, my dad printed out my bank statements and highlighted suspicious purchases, waving them in my face and demanding to know why I had spent money at a coffee shop when I was supposed to be saving. They controlled my time, my decisions, and my finances. Every move was questioned. Every step toward independence was blocked. I wasn't completely alone in this, though. My older brother, Nate, had lived through it too. But unlike me, he got out years ago and went completely no contact. I hadn't heard from him in a long time, but when I finally reached out to tell him I was planning to leave, his response was immediate. They're going to lose their minds when they find out. I believed him, but I still wasn't prepared for how bad it would get. For months, I had been searching for an apartment in secret. It wasn't big, but it was perfect. The rent was reasonable, and most importantly, it was mine. I signed the lease without telling them and started moving my things out slowly. A few books here, some clothes there. If they noticed, they didn't say anything. I was counting down the days until I could officially leave. But then, everything fell apart. I came home one evening to find both of them waiting for me in the living room. My lease agreement spread out on the coffee table like damning evidence. Diane was crying, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, while Richard sat rigid, jaw clenched in fury. The second I stepped through the door, he launched into a tirade. "How could you do this to us after everything we've done for you?" he demanded. Diane clutched her chest, her voice trembling as she gasped. "I can't handle this kind of stress, Leah. You're breaking my heart." It wasn't a conversation, it was an ambush. Every sentence was designed to guilt-trip me into staying. My dad started listing every so-called sacrifice they had made for me, while my mom sobbed about how she couldn't bear the idea of me leaving. They made it sound like I was abandoning them, like I was some selfish child running away from home instead of a grown woman trying to live her own life. I told them I was moving out, no matter what. That's when the real manipulation began. Diane suddenly had a serious health condition, a conveniently timed, never-before-mentioned illness that apparently required my constant presence. When I texted Nate about it, he immediately called me. "She's lying," he said. "She pulled the same stunt when I left." I wanted to believe he was wrong. Some part of me still hoped my mother wasn't that calculated. But then my job called. My boss, Melissa, pulled me aside, looking concerned. "I just got off the phone with your father," she said carefully. "He told us you'd be taking some time off for a family emergency. But you didn't mention anything. Are you okay?" My stomach dropped. I hadn't requested any time off. My parents were now actively trying to cut me off from my job, my last bit of financial independence. That was the moment I knew I couldn't wait any longer. I had to leave immediately. That night, while they were out, I threw as much as I could into bags. I had planned to move out slowly, to do things the right way, but that was no longer an option. I called my best friend, Mara, who had already offered to help me escape if it ever came to this. At 2:30 a.m., she pulled up in front of the house. I carried my bags out as quietly as possible, my heart pounding with every step. I didn't leave a note. I didn't say goodbye. I just got in the car and drove away. The first night in my apartment was surreal. The silence felt strange, almost unsettling, but it was a good kind of strange. No one was barging into my room. No one was demanding to know where I had been, what I had bought, who I had spoken to. No one was watching me. For the first time in my life, I was free. I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. The first few days in my new apartment felt like stepping into an entirely different life. It was quiet. No sudden knocks on my door, no forced family meetings, no one questioning every decision I made. I could finally breathe. I slept in for the first time in years without waking up to my mom barging into my room. I went grocery shopping without someone demanding to see my receipt. I decorated my space how I wanted, ate what I wanted, spent my money on things I actually needed. It was small, but it was mine. Then the call started. First, it was my parents' numbers. Missed calls, voicemails, texts. At first, they were demanding, "Come home." Now, then the guilt tripping. "Your mother hasn't eaten since you left. She cries herself to sleep every night. How could you do this to us?" Then the anger. "You are ungrateful. We sacrificed everything for you, and this is how you repay us." I blocked their numbers. That's when the unknown calls started. The emails. The messages from relatives I hadn't spoken to in years. The Facebook posts. I made the mistake of checking my mom's profile. There it was, a dramatic post about how her selfish, ungrateful daughter abandoned her sick mother, how she had done everything for me, and now I had thrown her away like trash. The comments were filled with support from family, friends, even people I barely remembered. "Stay strong, Diane. She'll come to her senses. No real daughter would do this to her own parents." My inbox exploded. Some messages were furious, demanding to know how I could be so heartless. Others were manipulative, urging me to just talk things out before it was too late. My aunt left a voicemail telling me I needed to fix this before I regretted it forever. I ignored all of it. I was done explaining myself. Then they found me. It was late, close to midnight, when I heard it, pounding on my door. Not knocking, pounding. My stomach twisted. I crept to the peephole, and my heart nearly stopped. My parents. My dad standing rigid, fists clenched at his sides. My mom crying, rocking back and forth like she was already mourning me. I didn't open the door. I didn't say a word. I just stood there, willing them to go away. They didn't. The pounding grew louder. My dad's voice boomed through the door, demanding I open up. My mom sobbed, saying she was having a heart attack, that she needed to sit down, that she was going to collapse if I didn't let her in. I gripped my phone, my hands shaking. I had seen this before, when my brother left, when my mom wanted to win an argument, when she wanted control. But still, a small part of me hesitated. What if, by some chance, she really was sick? What if this time, she wasn't lying? Then my dad tested the lock. I heard the handle rattle, heard him push against the door like he expected me to just give in. A chill ran down my spine. They weren't just here to talk. They were trying to get in. I called the police. The seconds stretched, every breath tight in my chest. My parents didn't stop their performance. My mom kept wailing about how she couldn't believe her own daughter would do this to her. My dad muttered that I was being brainwashed, that I wasn't thinking straight, that I needed to come home before I ruined my life. Then, suddenly, the crying changed. It wasn't over-the-top wailing anymore. It was controlled. Softer. The second I heard the police officer's voice, I understood why. I didn't open the door. I just listened as my mom told the officer she was here because she was worried about me, that I had run away from home and cut off all contact. She painted herself as a devastated mother who was simply trying to see her daughter. My dad backed her up, acting like they had no idea why I was shutting them out. Then the officers knocked on my door. I took a deep breath and opened it. I explained everything. That I was 26. That I had moved out on my own. That my parents had been harassing me for days. That I didn't want them here. The officers asked my parents to leave. That's when my dad snapped. His calm act shattered in an instant. He started yelling that I was being manipulated, that I was too immature to make my own choices, that I was throwing away my life. My mom sobbed that I had abandoned my family, that I had broken her heart. But the officers weren't buying it. They told them, firmly, that I was an adult and I had made my choice. They had to leave. They didn't go quietly. As they walked away, my dad's voice rang through the hallway. "You'll regret this, Leah. You will regret this." I shut the door and locked it. I thought maybe, after that, they would stop. That the humiliation of being forced to leave by the police would be enough. But I had underestimated them. The next morning, my friend Mara came over. She had already heard what happened and insisted on staying the night just in case. As we sat in my apartment, drinking coffee and trying to process everything, my phone buzzed with an email notification. Then another, and another. I opened my inbox and felt my stomach sink. My mom had sent me an email, long and rambling, full of dramatic lines about how she was sick with grief, how my father was devastated, how they were losing their daughter to outside influences. She said she wouldn't stop fighting for me, that she would never give up. Then Mara's phone buzzed. She glanced at it. Then her eyes went wide. "Oh my God," she said. "Leah," she messaged me. I grabbed her phone. It was a long Facebook message from my mom, begging Mara to talk some sense into me, saying I was being controlled, saying I was in danger. That's when I realized what they were doing. If they couldn't get to me directly, they would go after the people around me. I checked my other messages. My aunt, my cousin, a distant relative I hadn't spoken to in years. All of them were saying the same thing. Just talk to them. They're worried. You need to fix this before it's too late. I blocked them all. Then, as I was about to put my phone down, another notification popped up. A fraud alert from my bank. Someone had tried to apply for a credit card in my name. And the address on the application? My parents' house. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just manipulation anymore. This wasn't just guilt tripping. They were trying to ruin my life. And I had no idea what they were going to do next. The moment I realized my parents had tried to cancel my lease, something inside me shifted. Fear had been the dominant emotion up until now. Fear of what they would do next. Fear of how far they were willing to go. But now, I was furious. They weren't just trying to guilt trip me into coming back. They were actively trying to destroy my ability to live on my own. If I hadn't caught that call in time, I would have come home one day to an eviction notice, all because my parents thought they still had the right to control me. I spent the rest of the day locking everything down. I set up account alerts, added extra security measures anywhere I could, and even called my bank to verify that no suspicious activity had slipped through. Every time I thought I had secured everything, another horrifying possibility popped into my head. What if they tried to change my health insurance? What if they called my doctor, pretending to be me, and altered my medical records? The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. I wasn't just dealing with overbearing parents. I was dealing with people who were actively working against me, people who saw my independence as something to be erased. I barely slept that night. Every noise in my apartment made my pulse spike. I kept imagining worst-case scenarios. My dad breaking in, my mom collapsing dramatically outside my door, more calls to my job, my landlord, my bank. It felt like I was being hunted. And then, 2 nights later, it became real. I had just gotten home from work, exhausted but too wired to sleep. My apartment was quiet, the kind of silence that should have felt peaceful but instead felt suffocating. I had just locked the door behind me when I heard it, soft, deliberate footsteps outside. Not the usual shuffle of neighbors passing by. This was different. I froze. Then came the sound of metal against metal. The lock. Someone was messing with my lock. My blood ran cold. I crept toward the peephole, my breath caught in my throat, and my worst nightmare stood on the other side. My dad. His back was turned slightly, but I could see his hands. He was crouched in front of my door, fingers working meticulously at the lock. In his other hand, something small and metallic glinted under the dim hallway light. A tool. A lockpick. He was actually trying to break in. I stumbled backward, my hands shaking as I grabbed my phone. I dialed 911, my voice low but urgent. "My father is trying to break into my apartment," I whispered, giving them my address. The dispatcher told me to stay inside, to stay quiet, that officers were already on their way. But my pulse was thundering in my ears, my body locked in place as I watched through the peephole. Then my dad paused. He looked up suddenly, his head turning toward the parking lot, like he had just realized something. Then, without a word, he stood and walked toward the car parked at the far end of the lot. My mom was inside, sitting in the passenger seat, watching everything. They spoke for a moment, their body language tense. My dad moved fast, like he knew time was running out. He yanked the driver's side door open just as the first red and blue lights appeared at the end of the street. The police had arrived. My dad tried to leave, but he was too late. 2 squad cars pulled into the lot, blocking the exit. The officers stepped out, flashlights cutting through the darkness, their voices firm as they approached the vehicle. My mom immediately started crying. Of course she did. Even from my apartment window, I could see the act unfolding. Her body shook, hands clutched to her chest like she was moments from collapse. My dad, on the other hand, sat rigid in the driver's seat, his fingers clenched around the steering wheel like he was calculating his next move. An officer knocked on the window. My dad rolled it down just enough to speak. "Sir, we received a report that you were attempting to enter an apartment without permission. Can you explain why you're here?" My dad's voice was steady, controlled. "We're just checking on our daughter. We're worried about her. She hasn't been answering our calls." The officer nodded. "And why were you messing with her lock?" There was a long pause. My dad wasn't stupid. He knew there was no good answer to that. "I thought it was unlocked," he finally said. "I was just trying to open the door to make sure she was okay." Lies. The officer didn't buy it. "Step out of the vehicle, sir." For the first time, my dad hesitated. His fingers flexed against the wheel, his jaw tightening. My mom turned to him. Her expression panicked, like she knew he was about to do something stupid. But then one of the officers unclipped his handcuffs, and my dad finally moved. He stepped out. The second his feet hit the pavement, my mom broke down into hysterics. "Please," she wailed. "Please don't do this. We're her parents. We just want to talk to her." "Ma'am, you need to stay in the car," one of the officers told her. "But she's been brainwashed. She doesn't know what she's doing." I wanted to scream. I wanted to march outside and tell them that no, I wasn't brainwashed. I was escaping. I was trying to build a life they had spent years preventing me from having. But I knew there was no reasoning with them. They would never see me as anything other than their possession. The officer who had been speaking to my dad turned toward my building. "Miss, do you want to press charges?" I didn't hesitate. Yes. That was all it took. My dad was placed in handcuffs. My mom, realizing this wasn't going her way, started shrieking, calling me every horrible name she could think of. "You're ruining our family. You're a traitor. You'll regret this." I stayed inside as they were taken away. I stayed inside as the police drove off, my mom's wails echoing down the street. I stayed inside even when I knew, finally, I was safe for the night. I didn't sleep. But for the first time in my life, I didn't feel powerless. The next morning, my phone was already flooded with missed calls and voicemails. I didn't have to listen to them to know what they said. My parents had been released on bail, and now they were back to their usual games. My mom was probably sobbing, begging me to drop the charges, saying I was ruining my own family. My dad, for the first time, had no anger in his voice, just exhaustion, like he thought if he spoke softly enough, I'd finally give in. I didn't listen to a single message. Instead, I forwarded everything to my lawyer. The restraining order process moved faster than I expected. I had already gathered so much evidence, call logs, texts, emails, police reports, even the attempted fraud on my credit. My lawyer assured me that the break-in attempt sealed the deal. This wasn't just harassment anymore, it was stalking. Within days, my parents were served. The reaction was immediate. First, there were the texts. My mom sent paragraphs about how she couldn't believe her own daughter would do this to her, about how she was sick with grief. My dad sent one message: "You don't have to do this. We can still fix this." I ignored them. Then came the relatives. Aunts, uncles, cousins I hadn't spoken to in years. Every single one of them had something to say. Some were furious, calling me cruel and ungrateful. Others tried the guilt angle. "You only get one mother. You only get one father." As if I didn't know that. As if that meant I had to let them destroy me. Then they escalated. One night, an unknown number called. I picked up without thinking. The second I heard my mom's voice, soft and shaking, I regretted it. "Leah," she whispered, like she hadn't just spent weeks screaming about me online. "Please, just talk to me. Just once." I hung up. I blocked the number. The next morning, my apartment manager called. "Your parents were here," she said, her voice cautious. "They told the front desk they needed to do a wellness check on you." I felt like the air had been sucked out of my lungs. "What did you tell them?" "That they weren't allowed in," she assured me. "But I thought you should know." I thanked her, hung up, and immediately texted my lawyer. He told me to be ready for more. My parents were testing the boundaries of the restraining order, seeing how far they could go before getting in real trouble. That afternoon, 2 police officers showed up at my door. I wasn't even surprised. I let them in, knowing exactly why they were here. "We got a call from your parents," one of them said. "They reported concerns about your mental health." I almost laughed. Of course they did. I calmly explained everything. I told them about the harassment, about the restraining order, about the fact that my parents were weaponizing the police against me. I showed them the legal documents, the police reports. They got it immediately. "You're not in trouble," one of them reassured me. "We just have to follow up on these kinds of calls. But we'll make sure this gets documented." I thanked them and shut the door behind them, my hands shaking. It wasn't over. Then came the moment that made my blood run cold. That evening, I got an email from my landlord. It was a confirmation notice. "Your request to terminate your lease has been processed." I hadn't made that request. My parents had. I immediately called my landlord, my voice shaking with anger. "That wasn't me," I said. "My parents are impersonating me. You cannot cancel my lease." He apologized profusely, assured me nothing had been finalized, and put a security lock on my rental account. If my parents tried again, they wouldn't even get past the first phone call. But the fact that they had done this, had actually tried to force me out of my own home, made it clear. They weren't just trying to get me to come back. They were trying to destroy every piece of my life until I had no choice but to return. I was done playing defense. It was time to go on the offensive. I had spent weeks ignoring their attacks, blocking their numbers, shutting down their access to my accounts. But this was different. They had tried to erase my existence. They weren't just calling my job to get me fired, spreading lies to my friends, or trying to guilt-trip me into returning home. They were actively working to make sure I had nowhere to go. If I hadn't caught that fake lease termination in time, I could have ended up with an eviction notice on my door. I needed to escalate before they did. The next morning, I called my lawyer again. "I want full legal no contact," I told her. "Whatever it takes." She was already ahead of me. She walked me through the steps, filing additional police reports, gathering every single piece of evidence, strengthening my restraining order. I had already been documenting everything, but now I took it a step further. I secured my bank, my utilities, my healthcare records. I changed my security questions, put a freeze on my credit, and even contacted my phone provider to block anyone from accessing my account. My landlord flagged my name so that no changes could be made to my lease without my in-person confirmation. But I still wasn't prepared for what came next. A week later, my boss pulled me aside at work again. I felt that same tight knot in my stomach that I had felt last time, knowing before she even spoke that something was wrong. "They showed up," she said quietly. For a second, my brain couldn't process it. "What?" "Your parents," she said. "They came here." I felt like the floor had been ripped out from under me. She led me downstairs to the security office, where the building's front desk receptionist recounted everything. My mom and dad had walked in together, pretending like it was a normal family visit. They had gone straight to the receptionist and demanded to see me, claiming there was a serious emergency and that I needed to be sent home immediately. When security refused to let them past the lobby, my mom burst into tears. She collapsed onto one of the waiting room chairs, crying about how she just needed to see her daughter. My dad kept pushing, telling security that I was mentally unwell, that I had been manipulated, that they needed to get involved before it was too late. Security had to escort them out. The thought of them standing downstairs, demanding to see me, telling complete strangers that I was unstable, that I needed to be sent home like a child, it made my blood boil. But what happened next is what truly pushed me over the edge. As my boss finished explaining, she gave me a look I'll never forget. "Leah," she said, "they left something for you." She reached into her desk and pulled out an envelope. My name was written on the front in my mother's handwriting. I stared at it like it was a bomb. My hands refused to reach for it. "Do you want me to throw it away?" she asked. I shook my head. "No. I want to see what they're trying now." I opened the envelope. Inside was a letter, handwritten, 6 pages long. I only made it halfway through the first page before I had to stop. It was the same script I had seen my entire life, but worse. "You are sick. You just don't realize it yet. You have been manipulated by dangerous people. One day, you will regret this. One day, you will wake up and realize that your family was right all along. Your father and I have already forgiven you. We just need you to come back before it's too late." At the bottom of the final page, one last line stood out like a threat. "Come home before we have no choice but to intervene." I sat back, gripping the edge of the desk, my whole body shaking. They had already tried to control my job, my home, my finances. What did intervene mean? I didn't want to find out. I handed the letter to my lawyer that same day. She didn't even hesitate. "We're filing for a court hearing to extend your restraining order. The next time my parents tried something, They weren't just going to be removed from the premises. They were going to be arrested. Court day arrived faster than I expected. I had spent weeks preparing, gathering every piece of evidence, strengthening my restraining order, and making sure there were no loopholes they could use against me. My lawyer was confident that we had more than enough to win, but that didn't stop my hands from shaking as I stepped into the courtroom. My brother, Nate, was waiting for me just outside the doors. He had flown in the night before, ready to testify against our parents if needed. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low. I nodded, but I wasn't sure if it was the truth. When we walked in, my parents were already seated at the defendant's table. My mom looked fragile, eyes red and swollen like she had spent all night crying. My dad sat beside her, his face like stone, his hands clenched into tight fists. Their lawyer whispered something to them, and my mom immediately grabbed a tissue, dabbing at her eyes as if on cue. The performance had already begun. The judge entered. The hearing started. The second they were allowed to speak, my mom collapsed into sobs. She painted a tragic picture, two devastated parents who had only wanted the best for their daughter. "We have no idea why she's doing this to us," she wailed. "She was fine before. She was happy. But then she changed. She started pushing us away, listening to people who wanted to turn her against us. We are her parents. We just want to bring her home safely." My dad kept his voice level, controlled. He talked about how I had never been like this before, how I was once a loving daughter, but had suddenly become distant, paranoid, manipulated. Then his voice hardened. "She's been brainwashed. Someone put these ideas in her head. She was never like this before." I didn't react. I didn't even blink. I just let them talk because I knew exactly what was coming next. When my lawyer stood up, she was calm, precise, ruthless. She laid out everything: the harassment, the financial manipulation, the credit fraud attempts, the social media smear campaign, the workplace sabotage, the wellness check scam, the night they tried to break into my home, the call logs, the police reports, the messages, every single desperate, cruel, manipulative move they had made to try to destroy me. Then she pulled out their letter, the one they had left for me at my job. "Come home before we have no choice but to intervene." The courtroom went dead silent. The judge's expression hardened. "Mr. and Mrs. Calloway," he said, his voice sharp, "can you explain what you meant by this statement?" For the first time, my parents hesitated. My dad's jaw locked, and my mom stammered something about just wanting to talk to her. But it was already over. Then my mom pulled her final act. She clutched her chest, gasping for breath, her face suddenly pale. Her breathing became shallow, her hands trembled, as if the stress of the hearing was suddenly too much for her heart to handle. Their lawyer immediately jumped up, saying she was having a panic attack and needed medical attention. The judge didn't flinch. He signaled to security. Within seconds, a court officer escorted my mother out of the room. The judge called for a recess, but it was clear he wasn't buying it. When the hearing resumed, my parents' lawyer changed tactics. He admitted that maybe they had crossed some lines, but insisted they were just concerned parents. He begged the judge not to punish a family over a misunderstanding. Then the judge looked at me. "Miss Calloway, do you wish to move forward with extending the restraining order?" I didn't hesitate. Yes. I expected 1 year, maybe 2, but the judge didn't give them 1 or 2 years. He gave them 5. 5 years where they legally could not come near me. 5 years where they could not contact me. 5 years of freedom. My parents sat frozen, as if they couldn't comprehend what had just happened. My dad's hands clenched into fists so tight his knuckles turned white. My mom, now back in the room, looked completely drained, as if she had finally realized she had lost. As we stood up to leave, my dad leaned in just enough for me to hear. His voice was low, cold, dangerous. "You'll regret this." I didn't react. Then my mom, her eyes red and swollen, whispered, "You don't have a mother anymore." I turned and walked out of that courtroom without looking back. For the first time, I felt light. It was over. For now.